So let's talk about the strongest options of the Adeptus Astartes, with a look at 9 of their most competitive units on the tabletop in-game right now. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Space Marines, and in this video I thought we'd take a look at what people are playing for the Astartes most commonly, looking at their most common picks for strong units in-game, and what's making them good right now after the latest balanced data slate. In-game at the moment, Space Marines are a bit of a mixed bag right now. Core Codex Space Marines does seem to have one of the lowest win rates of any army on the tournament scene, though if you include the Divergent chapters it's not quite so bad. Quite a few Space Marine armies get into the top spots of tournaments, they're often run under the flag of say Black Templars, Dark Angels, Blood Angels or Space Wolves. For this video I was kind of interested to take a look at some of the more commonly played Codex Space Marines and competitive lists out there. So for this video I decided to do a bit of a survey of 20 competitive Space Marine lists that have placed highly at tournaments recently. I look at the frequency of units that were taken, whether or not they made it into a number of different army lists. For this one I thought I'd focus just on the Core Marine Codex as opposed to all the chapter specific stuff, so you won't find things like Black Templar Sword Brethren or Blood Angels Death Company here. But out of the more generic Codex Space Marine datasheets there were around about 9 units that stuck out a bit, maybe being taken just a little bit more frequently than the rest, obviously depending on detachment a bit, and 2 units that just really stood out regardless of detachment. Obviously that is a major factor. Some of these are going to be far stronger in some armies than others depending on your chapter or detachment choice, though I do feel like all of these offer enough raw strength that they're not going to be outright bad in just about any army, even if they might not be super hyper competitive optimal or whatever. I will talk a little bit about detachments and chapters for each unit as we go along. Jumping into it, I thought we'd start with the 7 units that seem to be taken a bit more prevalently, and then finish up with the 2 most commonly picked. I feel like one unit that has actually dropped down a bit since the balance update are the Inceptors. They're still worthy of a space on this list, but don't seem to be massively standout compared with other choices now. Though don't get me wrong, they're still very good. Inceptors went all the way up from 110 points per 3 to 130 points per 3, quite a significant nerf for their abilities. Their main draw to take the datasheet is that fairly godly 3-inch deep strike. They just turn up very close to the enemy and then shoot them with big guns. The 3-inch drop is just really powerful for a number of different reasons. You could use it to near guarantee that you can get certain secondary objectives and get victory points. Occasionally you might even be able to sneak primary objectives in that same way, or just drop next to an isolated enemy unit that really doesn't want to be shot at close range and destroy it, and hopefully leave your Inceptors in a threatening position for the next turn, though ideally not just massively exposed to the enemy for the counter-attack, as their durability per point really isn't good. Perhaps for chapter and detachment things, they particularly like the Firestorm Force for the +1 strength and the +1 to wound stratagem that they can get. It means that their damage dealing can be far scarier in that detachment, and they're also rather good in the Vanguard Spearhead as well, allowing redeploys to get multiple uses out of that 3-inch drop if they happen to survive. They do have some fairly good infantry shooting synergies there, and the core rule could make them a little bit more of a pain to take out. In armies they often tend to be taken in fairly small numbers now, often just the 1 unit of them, maybe building out to 2, generally being taken in small 3-man squads, both the guns being quite viable, the sustained hits, assault bolters being really nice at destroying hordes and marine profiles, the plasma weapons being good against 3-wound infantry and tougher things. In general in game I want to put them in deep strike and then use them as big options to use for both damage dealing or objective play. Either one could be the right decision depending on the exact game that you're playing. While we're on the subject of cool Space Marine models to add to the army, I thought I'd just mention the channel affiliates that I've got linked in the video description. I wouldn't usually go out and buy loads of miniatures just for raw in-game strength, but if you are picking up some things to add to an army, generally you can save a bit by going through discount retailers versus Games Workshop themselves, anywhere between 10 and 20% off, depending on where you might be in the world. Down below I've got linked Element Games in the UK, Gap Games in Australia, Wargame Portal in the USA, and Fenris Workshop in Canada. A big thank you to any of you guys buying through those links regularly, it does really help support the channel and keep the videos coming. On with the list though, and next up we have the staple in the Gladiator Lancer, 160 points worth of Space Marine Laser Destroyer tank. This one's really quite simple and effective for its battlefield role, 2 shots out, 2 strength 14, AP -4 and damage d6 +3, all at a really big range, and it gets those pretty amazing targeting optics rules re-rolling 1 hit, wound and damage roll, just making it very reliable and getting somewhere between 1 and 2 wounds on the target, depending on if you get unlucky with the roll. It's quite nice to have firepower that doesn't depend on other moments to be efficient as well, so you can target at something completely different. Plus it does have some okay point defense weapons to destroy some enemy infantry if they get too close. For supporting chapters and detachments, Black Templars tend to be quite good for the extra multi-melter shots that they can tack onto the Gladiator tanks. In their own detachment they could get a 6+ feel no pain as well, which is relevant. Ironstorm Spearhead is generally going to be better for any Space Marine vehicle. It gets even more rerolls there and gets some threatening stratagems like the return fire one when you've taken more than half damage. It also feels like quite a nice one for Vanguard Spearhead as well, lurking in the backfield and picking up that -1 to hit and the cover benefits, though I guess it might be competing with things like Devastator Centurions for that battlefield role. Generally the Gladiator Lancer is just a fairly strong datasheet that's good at its dedicated role. You often see them in army list as a bit of an add-in to the main strategy to cover some dedicated anti-tank. You might often see them in support of more aggressive, maybe even close combat Space Marine lists, where just having 1 or 2 of these gives you the power to reach out and quite reliably take down one big enemy scary threat, potentially something that might have had an unacceptable toll on your advancing forces. Next up, for a unit that I maybe wasn't quite expecting to see quite this common, are the Assault Intercessors. 75 points per 5 of them, and it does seem the latest points drop seems to have flipped them into a more commonly used unit for one that was maybe a little bit more niche. These guys are just nice enough, cheap objective skirmishers. 75 points for OC2, that's at least fairly tanky. They get strong rerolls when they're attacking things on objectives, and they can confer that to attached characters as well, maybe making them better to run with certain other characters. I've seen them used with things like Uriel Ventris before, while he gives his deep strike to a different unit, or perhaps alongside Vulcan of the Salamanders, or even Azrael. There's plenty of other good units that could escort those. Vulcan might enjoy the Company Heroes, for example, but the Assault Intercessors are now a cheaper and very viable option, I think. Being just cheap overall, if you're not taking a character, does mean they're a bit more expendable than some, not too much more than a fairly minimum investment scout squad. And if they had the right characters to go alongside, they could perhaps use impulsors if it made sense. I will admit that in the army list that were taking these, there was a bit of a skew towards Blood Angels compared with most. Assault Intercessors definitely seem far stronger in the Blood Angels Sons of Sanguinius compared with elsewhere. They get +2 strength and +1 attack on the charge for a strength 10 power fist and strength 6 chainswords, and they might still get those full wound rerolls on top of that. Plus they have the option for a Sanguinary Priest for extra AP and some feel no pain, and a lance and lethal hit stratagem. I feel like for most attachments they're kind of merely okay. For Sons of Sanguinius they're absolutely top tier. In general they seem to be fielded as 5-man squads, usually with a power fist, maybe with a thunderhammer. They can do grunt work and can be just a nice follow-on unit to back up your main threats on the midfield objectives, perhaps being a bit more expendable and maybe doing secondaries and things. Interesting that they now seem to be at a price point where they do actually compete with the jump intercessors that tended to be played a bit more before. They only cost 10 points more for jump packs, though they do lose the higher objective control. It seems that they managed to make the Honourable Mentions list for this video. They didn't get quite as many selections as the on foot version. Regular Intercessors also went down a bit as well. They seem like they were a little bit less common despite their very good sticky objectives type rule, though I feel like they're not an awful inclusion in an army list to get that in there. Next up, we've got the hulking mass of adamantium and flamethrowers that is the Land Raider Redeemer. 260 points for a great big beast with flamestorm cannons. Like all Land Raiders, being quite nice units to get things to melee, rolling up the board and disgorging a squad, averaging something like a 20-inch charge or so if you can roll a 7 for your disembarking unit. A lot of marine melee units can be a little bit underwhelming right now. They do tend to pair at least fairly well with aggressors, given that they can be stacked into some really quite nasty damage dealing combos. Plus, they're not really all that tough per point, so they're exactly the sort of squad that you want to transport into battle. The Land Raider itself is very tough though. It does like Armour of Contempt, and the Flamestorm cannons, once it's parked in the midfield and disgorged its contents, can be a massive Overwatch threat for enemies trying to get to midfield objectives, hopefully burning down an enemy infantry unit in your turn, and then again in the opponent's. The Land Raider Redeemer gets on very nicely with the Firestorm detachment. Strength 7 flamers with the assault keyword can get them where they need to be. A devastating wound stratagem for torrent weapons is big, plus it's got loads of transport tricks. It gets on great with the salamanders as well. Vulcan Hestarn can allow you full wound rerolls with those flamers and its bolt-on multi-melter. And Adrax Agatone is actually a really good choice for charging out inside of it. Adrax with Blade Guard makes a mess of things. and a Land Raider Redeemer is a pretty reasonable way of getting him into close combat. Basically any chapter with a scary high investment melee unit does well for them though. I've certainly seen them used for things like Black Templar's Sword Brethren or On Foot Death Company for Blood Angels. Often in an army list there tends to be just one fielded with a tooled up melee danger unit, not too often going more than that with such a big investment unit. It's going to be hard to hide these from enemy shooting, and they are going to have to live with a bit of raw might. You can usually still manage to tow part of the vehicle behind cover without compromising its movement too much though, and it's a really good target for Armour of Contempt in that case, potentially even saving AP-2 things on its 2+ save. Next up, we're back to the Gladiators again, and the Gladiator Reaper is a staple tournament choice for Space Marines. 150 points for a fun dual Gatling tank. This thing does just have some pretty all-round murderous firepower against virtually any infantry targets. The devastating wounds, twin links, and high volume fire keep it relevant against elite infantry as well. It is perhaps surprisingly efficient against Terminator equivalents, as well as just hordes. You've still got a good chance of shooting down a good 3 or 4 wounds off more armoured targets as well between its big hail of fire, so it's not completely useless against tough stuff either. Unlike the Gladiator Lancer, this one is quite a lot more detachment focused for being good. It's just really stand out in the Ironstorm Spearhead to the tune of most Ironstorm lists taking at least one. It just fits in really well with the options there. Ironstorm boosts vehicles in a few different ways. It really loves the sustained lethal hits on a 5+ combo that it can get. Really big with the sustained hits too that the Gatling cannon gets if it targets infantry. Plus it's kind of helpful to allow that detachment to be able to clear enemy chaff and objective holders extra fast, as it might be an army list that doesn't have all that many of their own, and plenty of big tanks that might be alright at destroying enemy heavies already. I think it's pretty solid for Firestorm and Gladius as well, both of those allowing some advance and shoot if they want, or fall back and shoot for Gladius. And again, Black Templars can be a bit more standout for it, giving it a multi-melter in place of a heavy stubber, and giving it just a little bit more threat against heavier infantry or vehicles. As mentioned, Ironstorm does seem to be the most common place to field these, often being fielded in multiples with all of those great options. It's still relevant for other lists if needing a bit more dedicated anti-infantry fire, and you've already got quite a lot of things that punish heavies though. The Gladiator tanks do feel like tanks that you'd want to play with quite carefully, given that they're not really all that tough for the cost. Ideally you want to coordinate it so these guys get the alpha strike and not the other way around. Next up, and still being solid for covering Space Marine anti-tank purposes, are the Eradicators, 95 points per 3. Their numbers do basically have them as the most efficient damage dealer against tanks. For the points, I believe they can outshoot literally every other Space Marine unit if they can get range on tanks, and particularly so if they ever get in melter range. But of course they do kind of pay for that with their downsides. They're inflexible and not as good against infantry, quite slow and shortish range which doesn't help them deliver to their target, and they can get locked in combat to stop the melter fire. There are plenty of options to deliver them available to the Space Marines though. You could foot slog them, particularly if you've got an advance and shoot detachment, strategic reserve them for a nasty anti-tank punch coming on from the sideboard, or transport them in something like a repulsor executioner, or land raider. Probably more commonly the standard repulsor out of those three. The Eradicators do seem to get on kind of abnormally well with a fair few chapters and detachments though. They particularly get on well with Firestorm Assault Force. Strength 10 Melter with the Assault keyword is exactly what they want to have access to, never mind the +1 to wound for Crucible of Battle if they need it. The transport shenanigans can help pretty well as well, means that you could have a repulsor shot by an enemy tank, then these guys get out and blow that tank sky high. Gladius works really nicely with them as well, fall back and shoot and advance and shoot both on offer through doctrines and stratagems, and they're pretty nice in Vanguard as well, allowing you some reserve shenanigans, some range durability with their core rule, reactive moves to enemy charges, and potentially a +1 to hit and extra AP stratagem. For chapters, there's options to teleport them around as well. Uriel Ventress could give a squad deep strike, or the Blood Angels Librarian Dreadnought could teleport squads and throw them at the enemy. Maybe a bit more out there choices for those, but could be game changing if they can drop a tank or monster that way. In general, they tend to be fielded in smaller units of 3, pretty much always taking the multi-melter, as it's just better than keeping a regular melter rifle on the other one. Attached characters seem to be kind of rare, the biologist maybe isn't too awful I guess, and in general for each game you just need to think about how you can best coordinate their firepower into the scariest enemy tank around, whether it's strategic reserve, planning on using a transport, or starting on the board as a bit of a counterpunch unit, lurking out of sight behind a ruin until something gets close enough to blow up with melter. Finally, for the first 7 units, we have the Primaris Techmarine, a 55-point efficient support character for vehicles, just bringing all sorts of good bonuses for that points cost. A +1 to hit on one vehicle, which could be something massive and scary like a Repulsor Executioner. Repairing D3 wounds a turn, which doesn't hurt. Lone Operative style protection if a vehicle's nearby, which could be alright for getting on objectives and things. A little bit of shooting with the Forge Bolter, and perhaps most surprisingly, an actual OK melee profile with a bunch of damage too, going up to a genuinely great melee profile if a vehicle nearby dies. That's just really a lot on offer for a 55-point unit, and provided you do have adequate tanks and vehicles nearby to boost, I feel like it's a very easy choice to add in. As you'd expect, he's basically auto-include necessary in Ironstorm Spearhead, given that that's going to be spamming vehicles in one way or another. The Techmarines are great for bearing those enhancements they get, things like the lethal hits or the canceller damage or the Master of Machine War, but they do genuinely get used elsewhere as well, provided there's some good vehicles for them to support. They may be a bit better for things that don't buff their own hit rolls, like the Ballistus Dreadnought or the Gladiator Lancer that build in their own hit rerolls. Pretty nice for plenty of other stuff though, say Redemptors, Repulsors if they're on the move, maybe even regular pattern Land Raiders, or other firepower tanks like Predators, Vindicators, or other Gladiator variants. Overall, they do see a lot of play, primarily due to Ironstorm, but Techmarines I think are just pretty standout good datasheets, obviously provided you're using vehicles. Finally, that leaves us with 2 left, and these 2 are easily the most common tournament picks for Space Marines that really don't care too much about detachments, hopefully scoring you the points and objectives while the rest of the army does its thing, and not really requiring too much investment. Before the last balance update, Inceptors would have been here as well, but as mentioned it seems like those guys are far less ubiquitous after their points rise. Some lists certainly still do take them, though they're no longer the auto-include must-take that they once were, now they're up at a big 130 points. First up of these 2 really popular tournament picks, we have the Infiltrators, fairly expensive for Space Marine bodies that don't really do all that much damage, 100 points per 5 of them, and are just seen as a really useful units to have around for the objective game. If your opponent can threaten deep strikers, they often make sense to put on your home field objective. Denying deep strikeouts to 12 inches means that your opponent can't get near, and definitely can't make a charge out of deep strike. And they also counter the quite large number of armies that can deep strike a unit somewhere outside of 3 inches of your squads. Otherwise, they do unsurprisingly have the infiltrate keyword as well. So it does mean that if you're not really caring too much about deep strike screening, they could just start up the board on a midfield objective and be an annoying presence to take out there. A bunch of extra bodies that aren't really all that easy to kill given that they get the Helix Gauntlets for the 6+ feel no pain, and they could use smoke for and a bit of extra durability in a pinch. You also do have the option to give the squad a Phobos Librarian as well, which is the one that prevents you from being shot at greater than 12 inches away. That one is genuinely an option that is used by some competitive lists as an all-in objective securing disruption unit. Means that you're just ridiculously safe from enemy reserves given that you can't be shot greater than 12 inches away from them, and enemies can't deep strike 12 inches or nearer. So basically there's no way to interact to them unless you've got a unit on the board that can actually move up and reach the unit themselves. The Phobos Librarian can also add a little bit of damage both at range and in melee. In general, as mentioned, they don't really care too much about specific army detachments. For the most part, they're not a unit that you'd really want to be using big stratagems or big investment from the actual detachment on. They work just quite well for most armies though. They could be a really good home field objective holder for a Space Marine melee force, or would help a lot with deep strike screening for a more gunline force, say supporting Ironstorm. I guess the Vanguard Spearhead does have a bit more synergy with them, given that they can get boosted versions of Phobos stratagems. Plus being durable is the main thing, so getting the -1 to hit and cover at greater than 12 inches is good. For use in competitive lists, the majority of players seem to just choose to take 1 unit of Infiltrators. Occasionally lists might build out to 2, or maybe put in a Phobos Librarian, though I feel like they're slightly more niche choices, that not everyone chooses to overinvest in them. Otherwise, perhaps the other most auto-include Space Marine unit for objectives and board control are the Scouts. They went up in points from the previous update, up from the fairly undercosted 55 points to 65 points per 5 of them, but unlike the nerf to the Inceptors, it hasn't really stopped most Space Marine lists from taking around about 1 or 2 of these squads. They remain a really quite cheap unit with Infiltrate, and just fairly impressive raw stats beyond that. You still get a whole squad of 2 wound Space Marines, even if they're in 4+ save carapace armor, and they aren't too bad on the damage dealing front as well, getting either a heavy bolter or a missile launcher, a chainsaw on the sergeant, and a fairly punchy sniper rifle if you want one. They have both scouts and infiltrators, so they can often just sit on a midfield objective to start with. Having scouts as well does mean that you could react a bit to the opponent's way that they've set up. If you happen to get first turn, you could move them right up to do move blocking or nuisance charge type things. Or if the enemy gets first turn, you could just greater hide in cover, hopefully denying the enemy as much damage as possible. Their return to the reserves rule I think is just an added bonus, allowing them to pop up and do secondaries around the board later in the game if that's a good thing. Or potentially be annoying and try and take down the enemy home objective if it gets a bit exposed and you can turn up there. For how they're fielded, they're often fielded in around about 2 squads per list that use them. Some use 3, some use 1. Both the heavy bolter and the missile launcher have got good points. I feel like the missile launcher might have overall more value, but the heavy bolter might be a bit better against the sort of units they tend to be tangling with. The missile launcher might be preferred in Ironstorm Spearhead perhaps. The sniper and the chainsaw both seem fine enough, and usually at least one shotgun can be helpful to keep them eligible to shoot for certain secondary missions. Sometimes it could be helpful to have that bit of extra movement and still be able to do something like deploy teleport homers or cleanse. Overall, still seems like the new Space Marine recruits aren't going anywhere, and they're still a very strong unit. Out of the specific tournament list that I looked at, they were the ones that were getting taken the most competitively right now, though there's still plenty of stuff that got taken at least fairly regularly. That's probably worth a mention, and I feel like there's loads of Space Marine units that are absolutely fine in the right army list, but might just be a bit more dependent on playstyle or exact choice of big guns that you like. Calidus assassins, as with other Imperial armies, are popular to jump round the board and do secondaries. The jump intercessors are a nice cheap skirmisher for killing enemy infantry and are quite cheap enough to do secondaries. They're popular for the Blood Angels in particular, in a similar sort of way to the on foot version. There's loads of options for other Space Marine big guns that are perfectly playable. The Repulsor Executioner, Redemptor Dreadnought, Ballistus Dreadnought, the Stormspeeder Thunderstrike to make some mid-strength things better against killing tanks, and plenty more besides. Predator Destructors, Gladiator Valiants, Vindicators, Devastator Centurions in Vanguard, and Storm Ravens in the Ironstorm Spearhead. All of those do see competitive play. The Combi Weapon Lieutenant can be fun to do some damage buffs for the mid-board, and can be a very annoying lone operative to catch up with his disruptive moves. And Impulsors can be used for certain chapters, maybe a little bit more tempting for the Black Templars though, who both get the boosted multi-melter and a good unit to transport in them with Sword Brethren. I was also kind of interested to see what's lesser played now, maybe things that have got nerfed compared with previously. There are of course loads of overshadowed Space Marine units given how many datasheets there are. Maybe notably things like Tactical Marines and Reavers are very rare to see in any sort of competitive army, same with Terminators unfortunately. And there's plenty of other things besides that could be kind of useful, but just rarely sees play compared with the more favoured options. For other units that were previously really common but got nerfs in the last points update, Aggressors are a unit that seem to have fallen away in quite a big way. They went up by 10 points to 120 points per 3, and I did notice perhaps a surprising lack of these in competitive lists, even if they are still okay as a centerpiece unit in Firestorm, Gladius or Vanguard, all of which have really interesting combos where they can just deal some monumental damage, and the infiltrating thing in the Vanguard Spearhead. I still wouldn't say they're bad, and I feel like once you've layered on all the boosts and things in those detachments, and often deliver them with a Land Raider Redeemer, they're still very, very scary. Maybe in particular though for the Divergent chapters, they rarely seem to use them now, preferring their own unique units to build around, maybe things like Death Company for Blood Angels, Sword Brethren for Black Templars, or Thunder Wolves for Space Wolves. Another one that's far less common are the Whirlwinds as well. They got a very big points increase going all the way up to 180. Despite some quite nice generalist indirect damage, it seems that they haven't really weathered the storm quite as well as some other factions' artillery like the Imperial Guard. Kind of a rarity to be seen now, the price for the indirect fire now being at a bit too much of a premium for most it would seem. In any case, it's been fun to look over the competitive use for a whole bunch of Space Marine units. Let me know what you're finding good success with on the board at the moment, and are there any picks on here that either surprised you for the positive or you think should have been mentioned. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I'm sure we'll have plenty more for the Space Marines. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep these videos coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.